So, do you want to play an arcane caster, but you think that wizards are a little too mainstream? Do you want to have flexible casting options that lets you fine-tune your action economy? Well, play those lands, tap that mana, because today we're going to be talking about Sorcerer in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Hi everybody, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our dive into the distinctive characteristics of the 13 official classes of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Now, like the Bard, the Sorcerer is a charisma-based spellcaster with a full spell slot progression. They also have a decent number of viable build options because of their different subclasses, including DPR, support, and control. If you need a quick refresher on the 4 main roles of combat in 5th edition D&D, you can check out our video on the topic in the cards above. Before evaluating the Sorcerer's 5 major mechanics, first, a quick review on how we break down each of the classes. First, we're evaluating the class purely from a mechanical perspective, because each class's lore description is a lot more malleable. If you want an explanation on why, we have another video explaining how to separate story and mechanics during the character creation process. And as a spellcaster, we're going to be looking at Sorcerer's spellcasting in terms of scope with specific examples, rather than doing a spell-by-spell, entry-by-entry evaluation. So with that out of the way, let's ask ourselves, what's the value in picking Sorcerer for my character in 5e D&D? Major mechanic number 1 is the Sorcerer's spellcasting. Yeah, we're just gonna go right for it. Now, as a spellcaster, the Sorcerer's spell list has a lot of overlap with the Wizard's spell list, meaning that in a party composition, it can fulfill a similar role. The biggest difference here is that the Sorcerer has the smallest amount of spells known of any of the spellcasting classes that we're going to talk about. Meaning that even though the Sorcerer and Wizard spell list have a lot of overlap, a Sorcerer player has to be much more careful about which spells they select when they level up. So even though they have a full 1st through 9th level spell slot progression, what they can spend those spell slots on is a lot more limited. The other big difference between Sorcerers and Wizards is that Sorcerers lack the ritual casting feature, which really limits their ability to be a utility caster. Now, as usual, I do have a list of standout Sorcerer spells that I've seen particularly effective at the table. These include Chaos Bolt, which is the only spell that's Sorcerer only. Magic Missile, Shield, Detect Thoughts, Hold Person, Mirror Image, Misty Step, Shatter, Counterspell, Fireball! Haste, Dimension Door, Sickening Radiance, Synaptic Static, Chain Lightning, Sunbeam, Crown of Stars, Firestorm, and Wish. And this is also a good time to point out that Sorcerers are the only class besides Wizards to have Wish on their spell list. And as we get into Sorcerous spellcasting, that's actually intrinsically tied to major mechanic number 2, which is Sorcerous Origin. I know, this is another evaluation video where I'm leaning on subclass selection as a major mechanic. Just trust me, this list would be really short without it. And the reason I bring it up is because, like Cleric, a Sorcerer's subclass is integral to its unique playstyle when it comes to a party's composition. So while a Wizard subclass doesn't really limit the experience of playing a Wizard, the same can't be true for a Sorcerer. A Sorcerer's subclass allows it to specialize in one of the roles that we mentioned earlier. For example, the Draconic Bloodline allows the Sorcerer to excel at DPR when it comes to specific elemental magic. And it also makes the Sorcerer a little bit hardier and a little bit more survivable. The Divine Soul allows the Sorcerer to pick spells from the Cleric spell list, meaning that it has additional support and control options other arcane casters don't get. And Storm Sorcerer has a lot of integrated features that allow for positional mobility, meaning that they can be in the right place at the right time pretty easily. Of all the spellcasters we're going to talk about, the Sorcerer options allow a player to build to specific elemental damage easier than any other class. No other class really rewards sticking to a single elemental damage type nearly as much as Sorcerer does. And this is starting to bring us to major mechanic number 3, which is Font of Magic. This feature gives your sorcerer a number of sorcery points equal to their sorcerer level. Now, even though at first the only real use of this ability is to convert your sorcery points into extra spell slots as a bonus action, it is integrally tied to major mechanic number 4. Major mechanic number 4 is Metamagic. Now this is the real meat and potatoes of this class. This is why you pick Sorcerer. Metamagic gives your sorcerer additional options to spend their sorcery points on in order to change the qualities of the spells they cast. For example, you can heighten a spell that requires a saving throw by spending 3 sorcery points, forcing the first creature that has to make a saving throw against that spell to have disadvantage on their roll. For 1 sorcery point, you might be able to cast Subtle Spell, which means that there aren't verbal or somatic components to that spell, so because of that, it can't be counterspelled. And by far, in my experience, the most valuable one is Quicken Spell. For 2 sorcery points, you can change the casting time of an action spell to a bonus action. And this really revolutionizes the sorcerer's action economy. Combine that with the flexible casting from Font of Magic, and the sorcerer has a unique economy of both sorcery points, spell slots, and how they time their actions. Even though they have limited spells known, it makes sorcerer players feel like they're taking very fulfilling turns round by round. And rather than needing to try to pick spells that require a casting time of a bonus action, they can use their Quicken Spell Metamagic to cast a really impactful spell and free up their action to do other things. A lot of times this takes the form of quickening a big leveled spell followed by a cantrip, but it could also mean things like quickening a fireball in order to take the dash action on your turn. And Metamagic doesn't only apply to sorcerer spells. This makes Sorcerer one of the premier classes for multi-classing a character. And there are some very interesting and powerful builds that you can do with this. Now there is a limiting factor. Like Eldritch Invocations from Warlock, a sorcerer can only have a few Metamagic options at a time. However, those options are very powerful and can be character defining. And finally, major mechanic number 5 is Sorcerous Restoration. After a short rest, your sorcerer gets 4 sorcery points back. Woo! Now, I know that ability doesn't sound very exciting, especially for a level 20 capstone feature. However, the value of this ability skyrockets, especially if you use custom rest rules. However, especially when you compare this to some other level 20 abilities of other classes, it's not the most exciting. So, in summary, a lot of the sorcerer's experience-defining features come from its subclass selection. However, it does have a lot of hard-hitting spells, especially at the higher levels. And it has a unique resource economy in its metamagic. So, whereas a wizard is valued for its ability to cast utility rituals and casting the right spell at the right time, the sorcerer is valued because it can change the function of the spells it knows to be appropriate to the situation. Now, as always, there are some rough spots for us to identify. The biggest downside to Sorcerer comes from its spellcasting. Even with Metamagic, because Sorcerer has such few spells known, it can feel kind of boring as a Sorcerer player because you're making the same decisions over and over again. Even though some of its choices are very powerful, it really limits the number of possible choices that your character can make. And some of their options are really best served in a different class that has ritual casting. And also, along with wizards, sorcerers have the lowest hit die in the game. Now, this is somewhat mitigated by the importance the player's handbook places on constitution in relation to building a sorcerer, but it still means they're going to be extremely vulnerable in certain encounters. Now, all that being said, I do find that if a player is looking to try out spellcasting, that Sorcerer is a great option to start with because there's not so many options that a player gets stuck in decision paralysis. And Metamagic can keep those few reliable options more interesting. So now I want to know what you guys think. What's been your experiences with sorcerers at your table, and how do you think their power level compares to wizard? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.